Podcast Playlist. You are listening to Podcast Playlist, a podcast about podcasts, where I, Brendan Hutchins, share what I've been listening to and why you should listen too. I intend to keep this show safe for work, but as a warning, today's podcast contains explicit language. If that doesn't bother you, let's continue. Luckily, for the second episode of Podcast Playlist in a series devoted to S-Town, I've been able to connect with a few other podcasters to discuss many aspects of S-Town, the creative non-fiction masterpiece in audio form. For a spoiler-free overview of S-Town, please check to the previous episode. Be prepared for many spoilers in this episode as I discuss the show with David Callison of the Sound and the Story podcast and Yuvi Zalko of the Neurotic Tornado podcast. I'm going to include clips from these conversations, but if you would like to hear the full interviews, I'm posting them in their entirety to my Patreon page at patreon.com/podcastplaylist. They clock in at over an hour each, and both contain great perspectives on the music and the literary aspects of S-Town. I'll also add some excerpts from the long-form podcast where Brian Reid is interviewed by the host Max Linsky. But first up, my interview with David. What were you thinking the podcast was going to be before it started?
That's a good question. It said, I kept hearing that this was like a winding story or a story with that goes in a direction that you don't expect. When I first heard John talking,
in the preview?
Not in the preview.
Did you listen to the preview?
Yes, I did. And I was really interested. I thought that the clock analogy was beautiful. Couldn't quite grasp what it might mean for this story.
Sure. Yeah.
My first surprise was just that S-Town meant shit town.
Right.
And that sort of changed a lot of my perception of what this story would be, honestly. Because Serial was, they didn't shy away sort of from anything, but it was still very, felt like a long kind of This American Life produced thing.
Yeah.
And, this felt very much in a different style.
Agreed.
Just even with the cursing and the things that they talked about,
right.
Which, for radio you can't do. And so that was really interesting. And then immediately when I heard John talking in the first episode, mm-hmm. I was worried that he was going to commit suicide.
Yeah.
And just as a person that's sort of been, I'm bipolar myself, and so I know mm-hmm. I've dealt a lot with the literature and all this stuff, and it was wow, those are some classic symptoms of
right.
It seems easy this guy could kill himself. I didn't actually think he was gonna I didn't think that was gonna happen, because then I was well, then what would the show be about? And,
yeah.
and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I didn't actually expect that. I thought something was going to. It did feel like that the murder might be they've dropped pretty hard clues that it wasn't that it wasn't a real thing.
What are your thoughts on whether this should even be made and put out and exposed to the world? Do you think it's exploitive?
Right. It's funny because my brother texted me just today, and he said it felt almost alien how much this guy exposed these people's lives. And I thought that was a really interesting comment. And they were exposed. Now, they did choose to talk to people, and it was obviously a very forthcoming community, as he found out, right?
Yes.
And again, you have
some
to
less so than others,
right? And you have to assume people's intelligence, and
yes,
they know what this is for. They know the possible consequences of it. In terms of John, it seems like he had to have had mercury poisoning.
Yes.
But we don't know to what extent. We don't know to how it was affecting him. And honestly, he died, and if he was still alive, I think that's a different story, honestly.
Right.
But he died, and and Brian knew John. You know, there's always, of course, Brian wants probably saw a really good story here also, right? So you can't discount that, but Brian knew John, and I trust the integrity of everyone involved. That's why when he said the pedigree of where it's coming from, I trust them to be journalists. Ethical journalists. And if they had problems with this, I feel like they wouldn't run the story. This American Life has had some run-ins with unfortunately, their guests not telling the truth and things like that. That they've gotten much more serious about fact checking and all that. So I think it's fine. I mean, to me, this is art, and I have such an extreme, I think a pretty extreme view that art should always be allowed and uncensored.
What do you think of the rest of the music? The
score, if you will.
Yeah, the score. Yeah,
I thought it was used tremendously well. It was used sparingly, which I really appreciated. Because then when it was used, I thought it was used very well. It was music that didn't exactly tell you how to feel, which I really appreciated. A lot of times in a movie, the score will, they're playing minor chords and you're supposed to be sad. But because S-Town was fairly ambiguous in a lot of places in terms of how you're supposed to take things, or, the characters were so complex as to not be described by, one.
It was fairly neutral.
Yes, exactly. And so I liked that the most. I thought that was so smart. And it did also kind of feel like it was kind of ticky-tacky, like a clock, which I really appreciated. And I thought it was good. I thought that using that in song was really interesting, and it took me a couple episodes to kind of get with it, and certainly by the end, you know more. Yeah, it feels like it fits more.
Yes, exactly. I totally agree. That was part of my conversation with David Callison of the Sound of the Story podcast, where he dives into a single album, picking apart each track and analyzing the lyrics in relation to the band members' histories. It's a great listen. My favorite episode is about The Devil and God Are Raging Inside Me by Brand New, because it is not only an amazing album, but the amount of research and detail that David put in illustrated a real passion for music and this band. Links to this show will be in the show notes. Now here's some more thoughts on S-Town with author, YouTuber, app creator, and podcaster UV Zalko. What were your thoughts on Brian's investigation ability?
Early on, I started to get frustrated with him. I was like, don't be such a wimp. And I mean, I know this because from when we were doing Neurotic Tornado, I was a total wimp with, especially at first, asking the right questions. You could pick, we were interviewing couples, and you'd be like, there's something there. We got to dig into that. This marriage isn't as clean as it sounds. And usually Jackie, fortunately, would say the more bold questions. And,
nice.
I learned how to be more bold. But I could see with Brian, I mean, he's obviously more skilled than I am.
Me too.
But you could see his timidity. Is that a word? Timidity. Both he admitted it to. I mean,
often.
He puts it there. He doesn't hide it.
No.
But it's also a little painful. No, go for it. Just stop being such a wimp. And you watch him grow and get more engaged. And once John dies, that's a big shift for him, where he's in it. He's emotionally vested, and he's not messing around as much when he's talking to people who will say the harder things. So it was kind of fun to watch the evolution. But at first, I was like, really? He's not going to go for that? I mean, when he doesn't interview the sister.
Yeah, exactly. He runs out the back door to get away.
He pays the tab and runs away.
Yeah. How did you think this was like or dislike literature.
Yeah. When you told me that about literary novel, it made sense to me because I remember when in my early days of writing, one of my first writing mentors, I was feeling guilt-ridden as usual. But in this case, it was about the fact that I was working on a novel that didn't have like as intense a plot as I thought a novel needed to have. But, the writing was going well, but I was like, it just doesn't have enough plot. Shouldn't somebody die in this? And my teacher, I remember saying, you just need enough, with a literary novel, you just need enough plot to hang your characters on. And just the idea that you don't need to have, rich characters is what might drive your story.
Right.
And you need some story, like they can't just never get out of bed. Usually, unless you're a real badass, but usually, things happen, but the main essence of it are you walk away remembering who those people were and how they felt.
Yes.
And that way, you walk away from this, it's like, I can't quite remember I know the guy didn't get murdered, but where is he? And you don't remember necessarily the exact details of that, but you remember the people.
Yeah.
Another thing, what I think about literary novels is actually in the same writing group I was in with this mentor, that we talked about love your objects and like the objects and the things in the story and the metaphors are very important. You don't want to overdo it and make them too heavy-handed, but they do need to have some meaning, infuse some meaning. And you see it right away, even in the trailer, with the clocks as a metaphor and time and the maze. But even little details like the door. What is the woman?
Is it Cheryl?
Cheryl, or is she the clerk?
Old town clerk.
Yeah. But talking about like all the kids' heights as they get taller are marked on the door, and also John's height is
6 feet.
Those objects and those moments and those things are so beautiful and big, and they linger on them. They don't just like brush right by to get to like the next plot point.
Right.
So that in that way, I also think it's literary compared to other stories. Well, and also the way they just dig into character, like there's some pretty uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable, but we learn a lot of details, like with the tattoo, the tattooing, and this other element to his character. And we don't fully know, like some of these things, we don't fully know exactly how they fit to the storyline, but they give us another perspective on this character and makes the person richer and more complex. Anyway, but they do that a lot with the characters. They're complex. There aren't obvious good guys and bad guys.
Right.
You could say what you will maybe about like whether the cousins are more the antagonist, but maybe not. They have a fleshed out perspective that's complex as well, and there aren't clear good guys.
Right. No. Everybody has their own motivations, their own understandings and justifications. Like, do you think that there is an ethical problem of any way that Brian handled the fact that John was homosexual?
Yeah, that's funny because
semi-homosexual.
That's funny because that's one thing I didn't faze me. Like other things I wondered about, just secrets and stuff.
Yeah.
But that, he admits, in his
multiple times,
his own crooked ways, let's just say I listen to a lot of David Sedaris.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
It's clear what that's code word. I listen to a lot of David Sedaris too, but I can tell what he's suggesting.
Yes, exactly.
He's not hiding it. He just has his own clever way of talking about anything and about this as well. So the outing, to me, that didn't. I didn't think that was a problem.
So you had mentioned to me that you took issue with the way that Brian characterized what John's behavior at certain points, especially around the end of when Brian wrapped up the murder, when he figured out what the answer was, that there was no murder.
Yeah,
and so I wanted to kind of elaborate on that, about what you felt about Brian's take on John.
Yeah, well, this may happen this seems like it can happen in any highly produced show, where you need a kind of a clean conclusion for the listener.
Sure.
And I felt like when John wasn't excited about the fact that there was no murder.
That there was no murder.
So Brian said this. Let's see if I can see it on the transcript here. What I admire about John is that in his own misanthropic way, he's crusaded against one of the most powerful and insidious forces we face, resignation. And it says he's trying to shake people out of their stupor, trying to convince them that it is possible to make the world a better place.
Mm-hmm.
That I didn't see that, like that he's trying to say there's a better place. Like I feel like when he's reading the stuff about climate change, which is all very depressing.
Yeah.
I don't feel like he's saying we could make the world a better place. I feel like more like he's saying we're fucked. And I mean, he does couch it in his own misanthropic ways. So maybe that's the phrase that you need to set this up.
Yeah.
Because I felt like his struggles with how fucked we are is beep. No, I forget if this is a beeping show.
Oh, I'm not. No,
okay.
No, there is no 1,000 hertz.
Okay. So because of that, it just didn't feel like, I felt like that was too clean a conclusion. Like I felt like his own internal suffering and other issues is why he was disappointed, not that he's on a crusade. I felt like his crusade might have happened many years prior when he was engaged with city council or whatever he was doing. And here he's still building relationships, so he is still helping people.
Right.
But a crusade isn't quite what I pictured.
Yeah, crusade doesn't. I
felt like that was a little too clean and neat, especially what we learn later towards the end, where he's going through all kinds of stuff, plus poisoning possibly. Or damage to the brain and other things.
The mental health of him.
Yeah, so maybe those elements along with physical and mental health issues seemed like that alongside. Maybe he didn't even care about the murder to begin with as much as frustrations with things going on.
Yeah, and I think that's what Brian's trying to say. Maybe he's overdoing it a little bit,
which maybe comes back to what you're talking about, how early on as a reporter he's still working out his chops.
That was part of my conversation with Yuvi Zalko of Neurotic Tornado. In his podcast, each session covers one or multiple relationships and how they work or don't work over the long term. It gets wonderfully weird. I highly recommend listening to Neurotic Tornado. The links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to hear the full interviews with David and Yuvi, please check out patreon.com/podcast playlist. Lastly, here are some excerpts from the Brian Reid interview on the Longform podcast, a show about writing with the aim to uncover the story behind the story and the story maker.
For this character that you're that invested in by the end of episode 2 and connected to have, obviously you guys are making this decision, 2 years later, a year and a half afterwards, to have him, to have the listeners find out that early in the series. I wondered whether that was a decision that came early, late, how you think about the timing of a turn like that.
What I remember about that is shortly after he died in real life, like, again, I kind of had these two reporting threads that I was looking at, like learning about his life, finding people who knew him, calling people on his contact list. That was one thread. And then this other thread of the estate battle. And I found that the more time went on and the more reporting I did on that stuff, in my head, like my just kind of like hazy sense of the structure, which was not written down or anything like that, I could just sense that the spot where his suicide would come in the story was getting earlier and earlier, to the point where I remember by the time we finally, like after almost 9 months had gone by of reporting after he died or more, sitting down with Julie to finally structure this out, knowing like I think we're going to do the news about the suicide at the end of chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of just out of an instinct of like, most of the actual reporting I have now, most of the actual action where things are happening, where there are moments where I don't know what's going to happen and then something happens and I learn something, the majority of that happens after he died, Like I'd only had one trip down there with him when he was alive, and then like 9 or 10 trips like after he died, you know?
Okay.
And I don't know what we would have put in the story to make it still a story that you'd want to keep listening to without telling you like this is actually what the story is about at that point, you know?
When you set out to like do something new, what do you draw on? Like S-Town doesn't sound like any other podcast. So where did you look for your like inspiration and how to do it?
Julie and I talked about novels. I wasn't involved in the creation of Serial, but I was around, and I've talked to Julie and Sarah about it and stuff. And I know they thought about it more like TV, you know? Or it's my understanding. I think this is true. I think Sarah was like, well, it'll be like an audiobook. And then Julie was like, no, TV. I think that's my understanding of the early kind of conception of it. So if that was more like TV, we explicitly talked about novels as like a thing to think about in terms of structuring this, and for a few reasons. First of all, like the world of the story, the feel of it, the details, like the metaphors upon metaphor that John was handing me, like in terms of the maze and clockmaking and just the whole world of it felt like a novel, and like that kind of seemed right. Then also, I've been pretty clear, like I always wanted it all to come out at once. And
why were you so clear on that?
Well, a couple of reasons. Like I didn't want to do the first chapter. I mean, a practical one, quite honestly, is like if we were to release the first chapter, you would Google John's name and know that he died. So I always knew that at least the first 2 had to come out together. Another practical reason is I cannot do what Sarah does. Like I could never write a thing every week like that. It's not possible. She's like it's a miracle that she can do that. I have no idea how she does it. I wouldn't want to do it. I don't aspire to do it. Like it sounds so hard and like difficult.
Yeah, it's hard.
I take longer. So that was another one. Those are the practical ones. But then like the feeling, like we knew that we didn't want every chapter to have to end with a cliffhanger. We didn't have that many cliffhangers. We had some. But also we didn't want to have to. Like it felt a little dirty or something to have to, or just boring or something. We wanted some chapters to have a quieter ending or an idea ending or a mood ending, and it felt like that would serve our ability to do that, to release them all at once.
That was Brian Reid, the host of S-Town, interviewed by Max Linsky of the Long Form Podcast. I love that parts of the process come out in this interview that are so fascinating, like that Brian only met with John once and yet had an incredible pull to John, so much so that he wanted to go to his funeral. Also, the reasons for putting out all the chapters at once and how they framed the whole series as a novel. I highly recommend listening to the full interview. Links to all these shows will be in the show notes. This is the second episode of the first series from Podcast Playlist, just about S-Town. The full Spoiler Town conversations with David Callison of the Sound in the Story podcast and Yuvi Zalko of Neurotic Tornado will be available for patrons at patreon.com/podcastplaylist. Please check it out. This episode was recorded in Yes, It Rains a Lot, Portland, Oregon. Writing and music and narration by Brendan Hutchins. The producer and script editor is my amazing wife, Sarah Hutchins. And moral support and infant distractions were provided by Sebastian and Autumn, Sarah and my cats. Send me your comments, suggestions, and recommendation success stories. I'm at the Pod Playlist on Twitter. I'll accept text or audio messages to thepodcastplaylist@gmail.com. You can leave a comment on the post at podcastplayl.ist, where you can also see the show notes. Please subscribe and rate the show in iTunes. Follow at the Pod Playlist on Twitter, and I'll talk to you next time. Happy listening. Peace.
Podcast Playlist.